The moment Eliza Sullivan stepped through the doors of the Hargrove auction house in Caldwell, Kansas, on a sweltering Tuesday in August of 1882, she had no idea that the thin gold band on her right hand was about to change the entire course of her life. She had worn it every single day since her mother died 3 years prior, and she had worn it every single night too, because taking it off felt like burying her mother all over again. The ring was simple, just a plain gold band with a tiny amber stone set in a delicate claw of hammered silver, and it was the kind of ring that most people would overlook entirely. Most people, but not Lionel Garrett. Eliza was 24 years old and she was running out of time. The Sullivan homestead sat 12 miles east of Caldwell on a dry, cracked stretch of land that her father, Thomas Sullivan, had broken his back trying to tame for the better part of 15 years. He had come out from Ohio with her mother, Clara, and a wagon full of seeds and dreams and furniture that was far too fine for a sod house, and he had built something real out there on the Kansas plains. Something that breathed and grew and gave back when the rains came in right. But the rains had not come in right for 2 seasons running, and Thomas Sullivan had borrowed against the land to keep the cattle alive through the drought, and then he had borrowed again when a fever took half the herd in the spring. Thomas Sullivan had died in June, quiet and apologetic in his bed, leaving Eliza with a ranch that owed the Caldwell Territorial Bank $430, a final payment due on the last day of August, and a father's whispered instruction to be brave. She was trying. The auction house smelled of sawdust and livestock, and the particular nervous sweat of men who had come to either make money or spend it. The building itself was a wide, open-floored structure on the south end of Commerce Street, with high windows that let in the brutal August light and rows of wooden benches that faced a raised platform at the front. The auctioneer, a short man with a red face and a voice that seemed to belong to someone 3 times his size, was already working through a catalog of farm equipment. Plows and seeding machines, and a nearly new harness set that had come from the Bauer estate. Eliza moved along the edge of the room toward the registration table. She had brought with her the one thing of true value that she and her father had set aside for emergencies, a matched pair of quarter horses, both 3 years old and well-trained, that her father had bred with tremendous care. She had priced them at $200 together, which she knew was below their true value, but she needed the money quickly, and she needed buyers who would come today. She was registering the horses with the auction clerk when she felt it, that peculiar sensation of being watched. Not the casual glance of a room full of strangers, but something more direct and more deliberate. She signed her name on the ledger without looking up, her pen moving in the careful cursive her mother had taught her at the kitchen table. The clerk handed her a numbered placard. "Your animals are in stall 7, he said. "We'll get to livestock after the noon bell." "Thank you." Eliza tucked the placard into her small canvas bag and turned. He was standing near the far wall, leaning against one of the support posts with his arms folded across his chest. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years of real outdoor work, not the artificially bronzed complexion of a man who spent his afternoons on a porch. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, and it needed cutting, curling slightly at the collar of his clean but well-worn gray shirt. He wore a battered hat that he had pushed back on his head in the manner of a man who had forgotten it was there, and he had boots that were old but well cared for and a leather vest that had been repaired at one shoulder with careful, even stitches. But it was his eyes that arrested her, because they were not looking at her face. They were looking at her hand. Eliza Sullivan felt her heart do something strange and cold, the way it did when you took a step on familiar ground and found unexpected ice. She pulled her hand slightly toward herself, a small instinctive motion, and it was that motion that finally drew the man's gaze upward to her face. He had green eyes, the sharp, clear green of creek water in the shade, and they were filled with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not admiration. It was not the calculating look of a man appraising something he wanted to buy. It was something older and more tangled than that, something that looked, in a word she could not quite justify, like recognition. She looked away first. She had enough problems without adding a strange man's intense staring to the list. The morning wore on. Eliza walked through the auction floor, noting the prices that equipment fetched and the mood of the buyers. Most of the men in attendance were ranchers from within 50 miles, and she recognized some of them by sight if not by name. There was old Preacher Calhoun from the Double C spread, and the Westervelt brothers from down near Medicine Lodge, and two men in Eastern suits who were clearly land agents of some kind, moving through the room with the brisk, counting energy of men who dealt in acres and not in sweat. She found a seat on the end of one of the back benches and settled in to wait. The auctioneer's voice rolled through the room in its practiced rise and fall, and the gavel cracked against the podium like a small, decisive thunder. She pulled her ledger book from her bag, a small cloth-bound notebook in which she had been keeping her accounts since her father's hands had grown too weak to hold a pen, and ran her figures again for the third time that morning. $200 from the horses, assuming they sold at asking price. She had another $47 in coins sewn into the lining of her travel bag, which she had been carefully saving from egg sales and the small kitchen garden she kept near the house. $247. She needed $430. She was short by nearly half. The thought settled on her chest like a flat stone. "You mind if I sit?" The voice came from beside her. It was not a voice she recognized, and yet when she looked up, she was not entirely surprised to find that it belonged to the tall man from the far wall. Up close, he was younger than she had initially judged, perhaps 30, 31, and the angular set of his jaw was softened somewhat by the uncertainty in his expression, as though he had asked the question and was genuinely prepared to hear no as the answer. There was plenty of room on the bench. She moved her bag an inch. "Suit yourself." He sat down, settling his long frame with the careful economy of a man in a room full of breakable things, and he set his own hat on his knee and looked at the front of the room as though he were paying attention to the current lot, which was a set of cattle prods and halters from the Morrison estate. He was quiet for a moment, 2 moments. She was beginning to think he had simply wanted somewhere to sit when he spoke again. "That ring on your hand," he said, in a voice that was carefully level and also clearly costing him something to keep that way. "The one with the amber stone. Where did you come by it?" Eliza's pen stopped moving on her ledger page. A careful, controlled stillness came over her, the kind she had learned in the months since her father's death, the kind that kept grief from becoming spectacle. "It was my mother," she said. The silence that followed had a texture to it. She looked at him sideways and found him staring at the front of the room with an expression that had gone very still. A muscle worked once in his jaw. His hands, she noticed, were gripping his hat brim just slightly tighter than they needed to. "What was your mother's name?" he asked. That was an unusual question from a stranger. Clara Marie Sullivan, born Clara Marie Hewitt from Winchester, Ohio." She watched him carefully. "Why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, low and careful, "Because that ring was made by my father. He was a jeweler in Winchester before he came west. He made 3 rings like that in his whole life, and I know of 2 of them. I watched him make the 3rd one when I was 12 years old, for a young woman who had just gotten engaged to a man named Thomas, a man who was planning to move out to Kansas." The gavel cracked. The room filled with the noise of transaction. Eliza heard none of it. "Your father was a jeweler," she said slowly. "Walter Garrett. He ran a shop on Grayson Street in Winchester from 1863 until he packed up and moved us out to the territory in 1870. He finally turned and looked at her, and his green eyes were entirely serious and entirely open. He told me once that that particular ring had gone west with a woman who had good hands and a good heart, and that he hoped the territory would be kind to her." Eliza looked down at her right hand, at the thin gold band with its tiny amber eye. She had worn it so long and so constantly that she had stopped truly seeing it. The way you stop hearing a clock that has always been in the room. But now she looked at it, really looked, and saw the careful hammering of the silver claw, the delicate intentionality of it, the way it was made by someone who believed that even small, everyday things deserved beauty. "He made this," she said softly. "He did." Lionel Garrett's voice had gone gentle, the way voices go when they are carrying something fragile. "And your mother wore it west." "She wore it every day of her life," Eliza said. "She never once took it off." She paused. "She died 3 years ago. A fever. My father kept the ranch going after, but he died in June." She was not sure why she was telling this man all of this. Perhaps because it felt in some strange and disarming way as though he already knew the beginning of the story and simply needed someone to tell him the end. "I'm sorry," he said, and the two words were so plainly and completely genuine that she felt them land somewhere behind her sternum. "Thank you," she said. "And your father passed in 1878. He never quite took to ranching. He was a craftsman, and I think his hands always missed the work." Lionel looked at his own hands, which were large and calloused, and clearly the hands of a man who worked with land and rope and livestock. "I have his tools still, never had the skill to use them." The noon bell rang, distant and brassy, rolling through the open windows of the auction house, and the auctioneer called a recess for the midday meal. The room began to shift and stir around them, men rising and stretching, conversations breaking open across the benches. Neither of them moved. "I'm Lionel Garrett," he said, and offered her his hand with the straightforward formality of the territory, where people understood that proper introductions were a form of respect. "Eliza Sullivan," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he did not hold on longer than was appropriate. "You're here to sell the horses," he said. She blinked. "How did you know that?" He nodded toward the clerk's table. "I was registering my own bid card when you registered the horses. I noticed the name." He paused. "Sullivan Ranch, 12 miles east. You know it." "I know of it. Your father had a reputation for good breeding stock. I considered approaching him 2 years ago about a stud service." He said this plainly, without apology, because it was a plainly practical thing in a practical world. "I never got around to it. The drought kept me busy with my own problems." "What do you run?" she asked. "Cattle mostly, some horses. I've got about 400 acres on the west side of Caldwell, runs up against the Chicaskia River. It's called the Garrett Spread." He said this with no particular pride and no particular modesty, just the flat statement of fact. "It was my father's land before it was mine, and his father's before him, or rather, it was my grandfather's claim, staked in 1867. That's a good piece of country," she said, because she knew that river bottom land, and it was. "It has its good years and its bad ones." He looked at her steadily. "Like everything worth having." She did not know exactly what he meant by that, and she suspected from the slight color that rose in his face afterward that he had not entirely meant it the way it came out. She let it pass. The room was thinning as men filed out into the August heat for their midday meal, and Eliza realized she had not eaten since early morning and had nothing with her but 2 cold biscuits wrapped in cloth. "I should go check on the horses," she said, standing and gathering her bag. "I'll walk with you if you don't mind," he said, and she noticed that he waited for her actual answer before standing. "I don't mind," she said. The livery attached to the auction house was a long, low building with open sides that let the breeze through, and the smell of hay and horse sweat was familiar and not unpleasant to Eliza, who had grown up with it. The 2-quarter horses she had brought a bay mare she had called Arrow, for the white blaze on her face, and a gray gelding her father had simply called Blue, because he had a philosophy that simple names were the kindest ones, stood in stall 7, looking well and calm. She checked their water and ran a hand along Arrow's neck with a tenderness she could not quite suppress, because Arrow had been foaled on the Sullivan Ranch 4 years ago, and she had helped the birth herself, kneeling in the straw at dawn. "Good animals," Lionel said behind her. He was not crowding her space, standing a polite few feet back. But she could feel him looking, and she trusted that his assessment was the informed kind. "They're the best my father ever bred," she said. He stepped up beside her and ran a professional hand along Blue's shoulder, checking the legs with the brief efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. "He's right. These are exceptional animals," he straightened. "What are you asking?" 200 for the pair." His expression shifted slightly. "That's low. I need the money quickly." There was a pause. She watched him do the arithmetic of other people's situations, the way decent people do when they are deciding how much it is their business. "You're short for the bank payment," he said. It was not a question, and he said it without cruelty. She considered denying it. She considered saying it was none of his affair. But she was tired and she was anxious, and something about the way this man had looked at her mother's ring with recognition in his eyes had stripped away a layer of the careful armor she had been maintaining for 3 years. "I'm short by nearly half," she said. "I don't know yet how I'm going to cover it." He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she heard the sounds of the midday auction yard horses calling to each other, men talking, the distant clang of a farrier's hammer from the street, and she thought about her mother who had stood in difficult rooms and refused to look afraid. "When is the payment due?" he asked. "Last day of August. That's 12 days. He nodded slowly, his eyes on Blue, who was nudging at his pocket with placid interest. He reached in and produced a piece of hard sugar, which Blue accepted with dignified enthusiasm, and Lionel Garrett smiled at that, a brief, unguarded smile that did something interesting to his face, making him look younger and less careful. "Your father bred good horses," he said again, and there was something in it that was less about the horses than about the man who had raised them, and less about the man than about the woman who had loved him, and less about the woman than about the ring. Eliza felt this without being able to explain it. "He did," she said quietly. "He was a good man, and your mother was a good woman." He said it simply, as though it were a thing he actually knew, and perhaps in some strange, inherited, second-hand way he did. "My father spoke well of her. He spoke well of the families he made things for because he said you could tell the truth of a person by what they asked him to make." Eliza looked at him. "What did she ask for?" "A wedding ring," he said. "Just a simple band," she said, "with something warm in it. She said she wanted something that looked like sunlight even in the cold months." He paused. "My father told me that story at least a dozen times. I think she made an impression on him." Eliza reached up and touched the ring with the thumb of her left hand, the way she did without thinking when she was moved. The amber stone caught the light through the livery's open wall, warm and golden. "She made an impression on most people," she said softly. They ate their midday biscuits. She offered him one of hers, and he produced from his coat pocket a piece of dried beef and a small apple. So they sat together on an upturned crate and split the modest meal evenly, and talked through the noon hour in the easy way of people who are discovering that they think at similar speeds. She learned that he had been running the Garrett spread alone for 4 years, since his younger brother had gone to work for the railroad in Colorado and had no interest in returning. He had 8 ranch hands, a cook named Dora who was 62 and terrifying, and a barn cat named President who was a calico female who had been given the name before her gender was established, and who was, by all accounts, profoundly indifferent to it. He had gone to the Caldwell school until he was 16, and then learned the rest of what he knew from doing it. He had been to Kansas City twice and had found it too loud. He had never been back east, though he thought sometimes he would like to see Winchester, the city of his father's hands. She told him that she had grown up on the ranch, that she had helped her father with the accounts since she was 10 years old, that she had studied from whatever books came through Caldwell's small lending library and had read her way through it twice. She told him that she made the best butter in the county, a claim that had been validated at the Caldwell Harvest Fair in 1880, and that she had strong opinions about the proper management of range grass that she did not often get the opportunity to voice, because people assumed she had not thought about it. "What are your opinions about range grass?" he asked with perfect seriousness. So she told him, and he listened, and twice he asked a question that showed he had genuinely understood what she said and wanted to know more, and the noon hour went by in a way that felt, inexplicably, like no time at all. The afternoon auction moved on to livestock and the room filled again. Arrow and Blue came up toward the end of the catalog, and Eliza sat in the benches feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came with the knowledge that she was about to sell the best of what her father had left behind. The auctioneer introduced the pair with genuine enthusiasm. He knew good horses, and the bidding opened at 140 for the two. It moved quickly. A man in a brown coat bid to 160. The Westervelt brothers pushed to 180. An older rancher from near Wichita, whom Eliza did not know, raised his paddle to 190, and the Westervelts matched him, and Eliza gripped the edge of her bench and thought, please. Then a voice from 2 rows in front of her said, 240. The room went quiet in the particular way it does when a bid makes a jump that tells everyone the bidder is serious. Eliza looked at the back of the head that belonged to the voice and recognized the dark hair curling at the collar of the gray shirt. Lionel Garrett was bidding on her horses. Nobody matched him. The older rancher looked at the Westervelts, and the Westervelts looked at each other, and the auctioneer's voice rose in its professional cadence, and the gavel fell. Sold to number 43, $240. Eliza sat very still for a moment. Then she rose and made her way through the crowd to the registration desk, where she would collect the payment less the auction house's commission, which was $12. $228 then, which was better than she had hoped and still not enough, and she was calculating the gap again. She was always calculating the gap when she felt Lionel fall into step beside her. You overpaid, she said. I paid what they're worth, he said. She stopped walking and turned to look at him. Those horses are worth what you paid and you know it, but you did not open at 240. You waited until the room was at 190 and then you jumped the bid closed. That was deliberate. He met her eyes without flinching. I told you they were good animals. You also know I need the money. I do know that. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't take charity, Mr. Garrett. It isn't charity to pay fair market value, he said. It's just math. It isn't just math when you calculate the gap before you open your paddle. He was quiet. And then, with the particular dignity of a man who has been caught being kind and is not entirely ashamed of it, he said, Your father bred those horses. Your mother wore that ring. My father made that ring. The world is smaller than we usually let ourselves think, Miss Sullivan, and sometimes paying the right price for a good horse is the simplest way to do right by all of that. She stared at him. The noise of the auction house moved around them, men pushing past with their paperwork and their pallets, and she stood in it feeling something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there for a long time. I'm still short, she said, $195 short after the commission. I know, he said. I'd like to talk to you about that if you're willing. Not charity, he added quickly before she could speak. A proposition, a fair one, I think. She considered him. He was standing in the middle of a Kansas auction house with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was simultaneously businesslike and utterly earnest, and the afternoon light from the high windows was falling across him in a way that made her think, with a sudden, startling clarity, that she would like to see that face again after today. All right, she said. Tell me the proposition. They walked out into the August heat of Commerce Street, where the boardwalk was crowded with auction day traffic, and the smell of horse and dust, and the food stalls that had set up along the road for the occasion. Eliza bought 2 cups of coffee from a woman running a small cart, because she had collected her payment for the horses and felt briefly, provisionally better, and she handed one to Lionel, and they stood together at the edge of the boardwalk. He drank the coffee without remarking on its quality, which was modest, and then he said, My ranch is carrying more cattle than my current hands can manage through the branding season. I need help with the books. My accounts are a disaster that I've been putting off addressing for 2 seasons, and I know it, and I need someone who understands horses well enough to manage the breeding records and help me set up a more organized approach to the stock. He paused. "I know what your father's ranch could do, and I know what you've been running there for the past years because people talk in this territory, and what they say about Eliza Sullivan is that she knows what she's doing. I'm offering you honest work at an honest wage, and if you're willing to come work for the Garrett spread through the fall season, I'll advance you the full balance against your wages." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "That's $195 advanced against wages, plus your regular pay on top once the advance is settled. You take me on as a ranch manager, not just a cook or a laundress." "I don't need a cook," he said. "I have Dora, and she would take it as a personal insult if I implied she needed help. I need someone who can manage accounts and knows horses. That's you." She looked down the street. An old Osage man was leading a paint horse through the dust toward the far livery, moving with the particular self-possession of someone who knew exactly where he was going regardless of what anyone else was doing around him. The territory was like that, she thought, all these different lives running in parallel, each one carrying its own weight. "I have a ranch to manage myself," she said. 12 miles, he said. "You can ride out on Sundays, or I can arrange for one of my hands to check on the property during the week. The cattle are gone, are they not? It's mostly the house and the land that needs keeping at this point." She looked at him sharply. He was right. The cattle were largely gone. She had sold what remained of the herd 2 months ago before her father died to cover the most pressing debts. What was left was the land and the house and a few chickens and her own horse. "You've thought about this carefully," she said. "I've thought about it since I saw you at the registration desk this morning," he said frankly. "Which I recognize sounds either very decisive or very presumptuous, and I'll accept the judgment." She laughed. It surprised her. It surprised them both, a short, genuine, unguarded sound that she had not made in a long while. She felt the surprise of it on her own face, the way the muscles moved that she had not used in that particular way for some time. Lionel Garrett looked at her with an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight, as though he had just discovered something unexpectedly wonderful. "The accounts are a disaster, you said," she said, composing herself. "Truly terrible," he confirmed. "I've been doing them myself, and I am not suited for it." "How many head do you currently have?" 412 as of the spring count. I lost some to the drought. "And your range capacity?" "On the river bottom I can sustainably carry about 350. I'm over that." She filed this. "You need to sell down before winter." "Yes." "That will require an accurate count and an organized sales strategy." "Yes." "And your breeding records for the horses?" "Non-existent," he said with a grimness that was almost comical. "I have a stallion and 4 mares, and I've been doing it by memory and optimism. That is a terrible system." "I know." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the August sun beat down on Commerce Street, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at something, and the ordinary texture of the world went on around them, and Eliza Sullivan made a decision. "I'll need to bring my own horse," she said, "and I'll need Sundays free to go to my property." "Of course." "And I'll need to see the accounts before I agree to the advance, because I want to know what I'm signing on to." He nodded without hesitation. "Come out to the ranch tomorrow morning if you like. I'll have everything ready for you to look at. And the advance will be a formal written agreement." "With a notary," he said, "if that's what you want." She pulled on her right-hand glove, smoothing it over her mother's ring with a gesture she had made 10,000 times. "Then I'll come tomorrow morning," she said. She rode out to the Garrett spread the next morning through the early light, before the heat built into its August peak, on her own bay gelding called Solomon. The road west of Caldwell ran through flat country first, then gently rolling land as it approached the Chicaskia River, and the river bottom itself was marked from a distance by a long line of cottonwood trees that ran silver-green against the blue sky. She found the ranch gate without difficulty. It was an honest, well-maintained gate with the name Garrett worked into the ironwork above it, and rode up the long drive through a double row of young elms that someone had planted with deliberate care, each one staked against the prairie wind. The ranch house was larger than she had imagined and more modest than the drive suggested, which she found she approved of. It was a two-story frame house, freshly whitewashed, with a deep covered porch running along the front and a kitchen garden in visible good order along the east side. The outbuildings were numerous and practical: a large main barn, a smaller equipment shed, a separate bunkhouse for the hands, a smokehouse, and a corral that was clearly well designed by someone who understood how horses actually behaved. Lionel Garrett came out of the barn when he heard her ride up, still pulling on his vest, and he lifted a hand in greeting. He looked, she thought, exactly the same as yesterday, which was not a remarkable observation except that she had been faintly afraid it would not be true, that the man she had talked to in the auction house for an afternoon would turn out to be a performance, a careful presentation that would prove hollow in his natural surroundings. He was not hollow. He walked across the yard with the unhurried confidence of a man who was entirely himself in this landscape, and he said, "Good morning, Miss Sullivan." You made good time, and it was the same voice she had heard yesterday, warm and careful and real. "Good morning, Mr. Garrett," she said, and stepped down from Solomon. He introduced her to the property with a thorough, unpretentious tour, the barn first, where she met the stallion, a magnificent dark bay named Copper, though she thought he should have been named Thunder, given the way he moved, and the four mares, Sage, Beulah, Red, and a filly-become mare who had been called Little Bit as a foal, and the name had unfortunately stuck. She noted all of this in her small notebook, and she asked the questions she needed to ask, and he answered them without condescension, which raised him considerably in her estimation. Then they went to the office, which was a small room off the main hallway of the house, and she saw the accounts. He had not lied about their condition. The ledgers were a tangle of entries in several different hands, his own, apparently some previous attempt at bookkeeping by an unknown party, and what appeared to be several desperate entries made during the drought in a handwriting that was his, but appeared to have been made at high speed and under significant stress. There were receipts stuffed between pages, a notation system that changed mid-ledger, and at one point an entry that simply read, "Sold something to Hargrove, I think 12 head, need to check," which was, she thought, not a basis for sound financial management. She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who knows he has done something embarrassing and is past the point of pretending otherwise. "I can fix this," she said. The relief on his face was immediate and genuine. "I was hoping you'd say that. It will take time, 2 weeks to do it properly. You have until the end of August anyway on account of the bank. I'll need you to answer questions when I can't make sense of entries. I'll be available. And I'll need a proper lamp for this room. The light is insufficient. I'll move a lamp from the parlor." She sat down at the desk, opened the first ledger, and went to work. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Eliza had not expected to find comfortable, and found, somewhat to her surprise, more than comfortable. She wrote out each morning in the early light, and she worked through the accounts with systematic precision, and she built the breeding records from scratch using what information she could extract from the muddle of entries and what information Lionel provided from his detailed, if disorganized, memory. She ate lunch most days in the kitchen with Dora, who was indeed 62 and terrifying, and who produced food of a quality that Eliza had not experienced since her mother was alive, and who expressed opinions about nearly everything with total confidence and no apology. "He's a good man," Dora told her on the third day, with the directness of someone who has decided that subtlety is a waste of time. "Stubborn as a fence post, but good through and through. You know the kind I mean." "I think I might be developing an opinion," Eliza said carefully. Dora gave her a look of ancient wisdom and said nothing more on the subject, which was, in its way, more communicative than speech. Lionel was not often in the house during the days. He was working the range with his hands, managing the cattle with the physical urgency of late summer. But he was there most evenings when she stayed past sunset to complete a section of the accounts. He would come in at dusk, wash up at the pump, and then find her in the office, and he would stand in the doorway with a cup of coffee and say, "How is it going?" And she would tell him what she had found and what she had done and what she still needed, and he would listen carefully and ask the questions that showed he was actually understanding what she was saying. It was on the fifth evening that she found the discrepancy. She had been working through the spring accounts, cross-referencing the cattle sales with the bank deposits, and she found a gap of $80 that had been noted as a deposit, but which did not appear in the bank records she had requested through the Caldwell branch. She set it aside and kept working, and she found another gap, smaller, from the previous autumn, and then a third. She brought it to him that evening with the ledger open on the table between them. He looked at the figures, and she watched his face go through several changes. "The accounts were handled by a man named Deacon Pryor for about a year," he said slowly. "He worked as my foreman and my bookkeeper both, which I know now was a mistake. He left in the spring, went to Colorado, I was told. How much of the accounts did he handle? Most of the incoming money. He traced the figures with one finger. I never looked closely enough. I trusted him. I'll need to go through everything he touched." He looked up from the ledger. His jaw was set in the way she was beginning to recognize as his response to something that required anger to be converted at high heat into resolution. "How much do you think is missing?" "I'm not certain yet. It may be $200, it may be more." He was quiet for a moment. "Can you find it all? Document it clearly?" "Yes. It will take a few extra days." "Take the time you need." He paused. "I should have been paying closer attention. I know that." "You were managing a drought," she said, and she was not making excuses for him, only stating the truth, which was that the years of the great Kansas drought had swallowed the attention of every rancher in the territory and left room for very little else. He heard this, she thought the plainness of it and the lack of judgment in it, and something in his shoulders eased slightly. "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed. "But the documentation will help you if you need to pursue the recovery legally." He nodded. Then he said with apparent irrelevance, "Do you want to see the horses run in the morning? I'm moving them to the south pasture, and it's a good thing to watch." She looked at him. The lamplight was warm in the small office, and the window behind him showed the deep blue of a Kansas summer night with its thick scatter of stars, and she thought that this was, all things considered, a very good place to be sitting. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." The horses running in the morning light of the south pasture were everything he had promised. Copper threw his head and moved like dark water, and the mares came after with their different graces, and Eliza stood at the fence with the early air cool against her face, and felt the particular joy that horses in motion always produced in her, which was the joy of pure competence made visible. Lionel stood beside her, his arms resting on the top rail, and he was watching the horses, but she was aware of his watching in the same peripheral way she was aware of the cottonwood leaves turning their pale undersides in the morning breeze. "You love this," she said. It was not a question. "Every day," he said. "Even the bad ones." He paused. "Maybe especially the bad ones. When something goes wrong and then you fix it and the land is still there and the animals are still there and the work is still there. That's a particular kind of good feeling." She thought about her father, who had said something similar in different words on a different morning that felt very far away and also very close, the way the dead are always receding, never entirely gone. "My father loved it that way," she said. "I know you loved it too," he said quietly. "And I think you love your land even now." She looked at him. "The bank is going to take it if I can't make the payment and keep making them. You'll make this one. And the next. The ranch needs cattle to run, and I've sold mine." He was quiet for a moment. The horses wheeled in the pasture, Red tossing her head at Copper's approaching thunder. Then Lionel Garrett said, "I've been thinking about that." She waited. "I have more cattle than this land can carry well. My south range runs up against your eastern fence line. I've ridden that fence more times than I can count, and the ground on both sides is good. It's actually better on your side, with the natural basin there." He turned to look at her. "I'm not offering charity," he said, with the emphasis of a man who has learned to say this first. I'm offering a genuine partnership of the practical kind. If you're willing, I could move a portion of my herd, say, 75 head onto the Sullivan land under a grazing agreement. I pay you a fair grazing fee per head per month, which keeps the land productive and brings you an income. You keep the property maintained. We both benefit. She turned this over carefully, as she turned all things over, looking for the angles and the conditions and the places where it could fail. And when the agreement ends, when you're back on your feet and want to rebuild your own herd, we renegotiate or dissolve. It's in writing either way. She looked at the horses in the pasture. You've spent a fair amount of time thinking about my situation, she said. A color moved briefly in his face. I've spent some time thinking about it, yes. Why? He held her gaze for a long moment. The morning was bright around them, the kind of bright that Kansas mornings produce in August when the sky has no cloud in it, and the light seems to come from everywhere at once. In that light, his green eyes were the clear color of creek water and entirely serious. Because I would like you to be here longer than August, he said. The statement was simple and direct and completely unadorned, and it landed on her with the weight of simple, direct, unadorned things. She was not a person who misunderstood plain speech, and she did not misunderstand this. The accounts will take until the end of the month, she said, choosing her words carefully, testing the shape of the conversation. I know, he said, and after the accounts there is the fall cattle sort that I mentioned and the breeding records that still need to be fully formalized. So there would be work into September. Into October, at least, possibly beyond. She looked at the horses. She looked at the land. She looked at her own right hand on the fence rail, at the small amber eye of her mother's ring catching the morning light. The grazing agreement would need to be drawn up by the end of the month, she said, before the bank payment. I'll have it ready within the week. And the advance will be settled from wages as agreed. As agreed. She breathed in the August morning, the dry grass and the river smell from the cottonwoods and the clean animal warmth of the horses, and she made another decision. All right, she said. We'll continue. She found, as September came on, that the work she was doing on the Garrett spread was the kind of work she had always been suited for and had never quite had the full scope to do. The accounts came clear under her hands. The discrepancy documented to a total of $217 that could be laid definitively at the feet of Deacon Pryor and his light-fingered tenure. Lionel sent a letter to the county sheriff and another to the railroad company that Pryor had reportedly gone to work for, and the documentation Eliza had prepared made both letters unambiguous and thorough. She organized the breeding records for the horses with the precision of someone who understood genetics before that word was commonly in use, documenting bloodlines and temperament notes and the projected value of future foals. She built a herd management spreadsheet, her own design, adapted from a method she had read about in an agricultural journal that Caldwell's lending library had received from Ohio, that gave Lionel for the first time a clear picture of what he had, what it was worth, and what he needed to sell before winter. The bank payment was made on August 29th. Eliza rode to Caldwell herself, sat across the desk from the bank manager, a thin man named Harold Peabody who wore his self-importance like an oversized coat, and placed the full $430 on his desk in a neat envelope. Peabody's eyebrows rose slightly at the amount. In full, she said. Indeed, said Peabody. I'll take a receipt. She rode home to her own home, the Sullivan homestead, for the first time in 3 weeks and stood in the yard for a while, looking at the house her father had built, and the land her mother had loved and the basin pasture where 75 of Lionel's cattle were currently grazing in content, well-fed lines. The property felt different than it had in June, after her father died. It felt less like grief and more like potential. She was still standing there when she heard hoofbeats on the drive and turned to find Lionel riding up on a leggy chestnut she had not seen before. I wanted to make sure you got there and back safely, he said. I'm 24 years old and I've been riding alone since I was 8, she said. I know. He dismounted with easy grace. I also wanted to see the place in daylight. I've only ridden past in the early morning before. She turned to look at it with him, trying to see it through a stranger's eyes. The house was well built, if weathered, and the yard was tidier than it had any right to be given the summer she had been through. The barn needed paint and the south fence needed mending, but the bones of the place were good. Your father built this himself? Lionel asked. Him and two neighbors and my mother's brothers who came out from Ohio for one summer and then went directly home and never came back, she said. Uncle Garrett and Uncle Miles, who were born to be town men and were not shy about knowing it. Your uncle was named Garrett. She had not registered that until he said it. He was. Garrett Hewitt, my mother's eldest brother. She looked at him sideways. That's a coincidence. Or not, he said, with a slight smile that she was learning to watch for, because it was always preceded by something worth paying attention to. My father named his shop for his best customers. He called it the Hewitt and Friends Jewelry Shop for a while in the early years. Did your mother ever mention that? She might have, Eliza said slowly, thinking back through the archive of childhood memory. She mentioned his name, the jeweler. I think she called him Walter. She said he was a gentle man who made things the way they deserved to be made. That was him precisely, Lionel said, with a quiet, genuine warmth. They walked the property together in the September afternoon, and she showed him the basin pasture and explained why her father had chosen the specific gradient for the water channel that fed it. And he listened and asked the right questions and looked at the land with the same quality of attention he gave everything, which was total and unhurried. He told her about the first cattle drive his grandfather had brought through this country in 1867, before the homestead claims, when the land was open grass from horizon to horizon, and the great buffalo herds were still moving through, though smaller than they had been. He told her about the cattle drives he remembered from childhood, the Kisham Trail years, when Caldwell was a roaring end-of-trail town and Commerce Street had a different character entirely. He told her this without nostalgia, just as history, the kind of history that lands in the body when it is your own. The territory is changing, he said. It's become something more fixed, fenced and settled and measured. Is that bad? It's different. Some things are lost. Some things are gained. He paused. I think what's gained is the right to stay, to build something that endures. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the September light was long and gold across the basin pasture, and the cattle moved in their slow, contented circles, and she thought that this was what her mother had come for, all those years ago from Winchester, not the wildness, but the endurance of the thing that grows in wildness. It was October when he kissed her. They had been working late in the ranch office, completing the fall cattle sort documentation, and the night had come on cold and clear outside the window, and Dora had brought in coffee and given them both a look of such triumphant significance that Eliza had fixed her gaze firmly on the ledger until the old woman retreated. And then Lionel had leaned over to point at a figure in the accounts, and his shoulder had been warm against hers, and she had turned to say something about the figure, and found his face very close to hers and his green eyes looking at her with the particular expression she had been learning for 2 months, the one that was warmer and less careful than his usual careful warmth. She was not entirely surprised when he kissed her. She was entirely moved. It was a brief kiss, gentle and serious, the way he was in most things, and when he pulled back he looked at her with the slightly stunned expression of a man who has done something brave and is waiting to find out if it was wise. "Eliza," he said. "You have a smudge of ink on your chin," she said, because she needed a moment. He reached up and rubbed at his chin. "Did I get it?" "Mostly." She reached up and brushed the last of it away with the pad of her thumb, and her hand stayed at the side of his face for a moment, and they looked at each other in the lamplight of the small office with the cold night outside and the warmth between them, and she thought, this is the kind of thing my mother would have understood immediately. "I should like to court you properly if you're willing," he said. "I'm aware that the situation has been unconventional." "Very unconventional," she agreed. But I don't think that changes how I feel, and I would rather say so plainly than be unclear. I appreciate clarity, she said. Then I'll be clear. I would like very much to spend more time with you in ways that are not only about accounts, though I also value the accounts. She laughed again, the same surprised, unguarded sound she had made in the auction house in August, the one that seemed to please him so much. I would like that, she said. The more time, that is, both kinds. He smiled at her, the full version, not the small, careful one. And it was exactly as devastating as she had suspected it would be if it was ever fully deployed. The courtship proceeded over the autumn and into the early winter with the practical romance of two people who understand what they are doing and find joy in the doing of it. He rode out to her property on Sunday mornings, and she showed him the plans she had for the land when she could rebuild the herd, and he contributed ideas and occasionally a pair of strong hands for the fence mending. She stayed late at the ranch most evenings and they talked through everything. The cattle management, the state of the territory, books they had both read, the memory of their parents, the particular texture of grief and of going forward through it. He brought her coffee, and she brought him apple cake that she made on Saturday evenings from the kitchen garden's last apples. And these small domestic details accumulated between them with the quiet weight of things that are becoming permanent. He told her about the year after his father died, when he had run the ranch alone for the first time, and had been so isolated that he had started talking to the barn cat, because it was the only presence in the house at night that seemed genuinely interested in him. She told him about the night her mother died, and the way the house had felt afterward, not empty, exactly, but rearranged, like a room where the furniture has been moved in the dark. I kept wearing the ring, she said. They were sitting on the porch of her house on a November Sunday, with cups of tea going cold in their hands because they had forgotten to drink them, and the Kansas plains stretched wide and brown and dormant under a sky that was thinking about snow. I knew it was her ring, but it felt like if I kept it on, she was still present in some way, still choosing me. She is, he said simply. You carry her in the way you think and the way you work and the way you take care of things. That's what people leave behind. She looked at him for a long moment. Your father made something beautiful, she said, in this ring. And whatever else he made, and whoever else he made things for, this one has had a very particular life. He would have loved knowing that, Lionel said. She took the ring off for the first time in 3 years. Just for a moment, just to look at it properly, turning it in the thin November light so the amber stone caught what warmth the sky was offering and held it. The band was worn thin on the inside from constant wearing, polished by 30 years of Clara Hewitt Sullivan's skin. She could see the faint marks of the hammer that had shaped it, the deliberate individual marks of Walter Garrett's craft. She put it back on her right hand and looked up to find Lionel watching her with the expression she could now read entirely, which was love, plain and clear and thorough, the kind that does not announce itself dramatically because it does not need to. Lionel, she said, yes. Are you going to ask me to marry you, or are we going to spend another 3 months talking around it? The look on his face traveled through surprise and settled firmly in delight. I was building toward it, he said. I had a plan. I know you had a plan. You always have a plan. I was offering you an alternative approach. He stood up from the porch steps, and he turned to face her where she sat, and he took both her hands in his, and held them with the careful firmness of a man holding something of value. Eliza Sullivan, he said, you walked into a Kansas auction house in August wearing your dead mother's ring, and I recognized it before you said a word, and I thought the world was stranger and more deliberate than I usually gave it credit for. I have spent the last 3 months becoming more certain of that with every passing day. I would like very much for you to be my wife, and for this to be our life, and for whatever we build here to be built together, if you are willing. She squeezed his hands. I am willing, she said. He smiled, the full, complete, unguarded smile, and she thought, as she had thought in the October office by lamplight, that it was as devastating as she had always suspected. She stood up from the porch step and kissed him, this time with full intention and no brevity about it, with the cold November air around them and the plains stretching away in every direction, and somewhere in the cottonwood trees along the creek, a hawk calling once sharply, like the coda to a sentence. They married in December, in the Caldwell church on the corner of Commerce and Elm, on a day when the sky was low and white, and the first real snow of the season fell in soft, indifferent curtains across the town. The ceremony was performed by Pastor Reynolds, who was a tall, thin man with a surprisingly good voice, and it was attended by the Garrett Ranch hands and Dora, who wept with the aggressive efficiency of someone who is crying, because they have every right to and intend to do it thoroughly, and by a small collection of Caldwell neighbors and acquaintances who had followed the courtship with the interested attention that small communities devote to the romantic lives of their members. Eliza wore a dress of deep blue wool that Dora had helped her make, with her mother's ring on her right hand, and a pair of small pearl earrings that had been her mother's as well, and she stood at the front of the church with snow falling past the windows and Lionel's hands holding hers, and thought that she had never in her life felt so precisely and completely where she was supposed to be. After the ceremony, they stood on the church steps with snow settling on their shoulders while people offered congratulations, and Preacher Calhoun pumped Lionel's hand and said he had always known a Garrett could pick well, and the Westervelt brothers made a great deal of noise about what a fine wedding it was, and Dora pressed a small wrapped package into Eliza's hands and said, "Open it later," with an expression of great emotional dignity. Inside, as Eliza discovered that evening, were Walter Garrett's jeweler's tools, wrapped in clean cloth and tied with a blue ribbon. Dora had asked Lionel if she could give them, and he had said yes immediately, and the gift was right in every way. They settled into the life of the Garrett Ranch through that first winter, with the naturalness of two people who have been thinking about the shape of their shared days for months, and have had the good sense to be honest about it. The ranch house became more fully inhabited. Eliza brought the best of her mother's things from the Sullivan homestead, the fine furniture that had come from Ohio 30 years ago and was still good, and it found places in the rooms with the organic logic of things that belong somewhere. She ran the accounts with increasing efficiency and designed a herd management system that Lionel's hands began to refer to with frank admiration as Miss Eliza's map, even after she became Mrs. Garrett, and they continued to call it that because the name had stuck. She continued to oversee the Sullivan property through the winter, making the ride on fine days, keeping the house sound and the basin pasture managed for the grazing agreement cattle. She wrote to her Uncle Garrett Hewitt in Ohio to tell him about the marriage, and included in the letter the strange coincidence of the names and the ring and the jeweler, and received back a letter of such joyful incoherence that she read it aloud to Lionel 3 times, and they laughed until they were breathless at the pleasure of the old man's happiness. Deacon Pryor was found in Colorado Springs in the spring of 1883, working for a small freight company. The documentation Eliza had prepared was thorough enough that the county sheriff was able to make a legal case, and Pryor returned $200 of the missing 217 before disappearing again in a direction that nobody was confident of. Lionel considered pursuing further recovery, and then decided that $200 recovered and a lesson learned was sufficient, and spent the recovered money on repairing the Sullivan barn roof, which needed it badly. Spring came to the Kansas plains with the particular drama of plains spring, violent and sudden and extravagant, great rolling thunderstorms from the southwest that turned the brown grass green in what seemed like days, and the river running high and loud through the cottonwoods, and the horses throwing their heads in the pasture and behaving like idiots for joy. Eliza told him she was carrying their child on a morning in April, standing in the kitchen garden while the early light came in pink and clear, and his reaction was everything she might have hoped, a kind of arrested stillness, and then a smile so complete and open that it reached every part of his face, and she thought she had never seen a man look so purely happy. "When?" he asked. "October, I think." "October," he said, as though the month had just acquired a new and particular significance, which it had. He took her hands carefully, the way he had on the porch of her house in November, and he looked at her with the love that she had stopped being surprised by and had begun instead to rely on. "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said, "though I have strong opinions about ginger tea at the moment." "I will source ginger tea from every supplier in Caldwell," he said with absolute gravity. "That may be more ginger tea than is necessary. I prefer to be thorough." She laughed, and he laughed with her, and the garden was bright around them, and the Kansas morning was coming on warm, and she thought, "My mother would have loved this." The summer of 1883 was better than the two before it, the rains coming at the right intervals and the grass recovering its proper depth across the range. The Sullivan property, with its grazing cattle and its maintained water systems, was looking more like land with a future than it had in years. Eliza began, in the long summer evenings, to draw up the plans for eventually restocking it with her own herd, not as a separate enterprise, but as an extension of what she and Lionel were building, a Sullivan-Garrett operation that used the natural geography of both properties and the complementary strengths of two people who knew what they were doing. She presented the plan to him in August, sitting on the porch in the long twilight with the plains going gold around them. He read it carefully, asked 4 precise questions, suggested one modification about the water access points that she immediately recognized was better than her original approach, and then folded it and handed it back to her and said, "When do you want to start?" "Spring," she said. "After the baby," he nodded. "Spring." She looked out at the range. "My father would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," he said. "I would have liked him. My mother would have interrogated you for 3 hours and then fed you the best dinner of your life and told you privately that she approved, but only because you were honest about not being very good at the accounts and everyone should know their limitations." He smiled. "I would have been honored by that. You would have deserved it." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the August evening in the way of people who have stopped performing contentment and are simply living it, which is a different and better thing. Their son was born on October the 14th, 1883, after a hard and triumphant labor attended by the Caldwell doctor and Dora, who proved herself as useful in a birth room as she was everywhere else. He was a large, healthy, furious baby with dark hair and green eyes that Lionel said were clearly a Garrett trait, and Eliza said were as yet indeterminate. And they argued about this cheerfully for several weeks while the baby in question ignored the whole discussion in favor of eating and sleeping, and occasionally bellowing. They named him Thomas Walter Garrett Thomas for Eliza's father, Walter for Lionel's, because there was something right and whole about those names together, and because the ring on Eliza's hand and the tools in Dora's wrapped gift had always been pointing toward this. Dora, upon hearing the names, retired briefly to the kitchen and was heard making no sounds of any kind for approximately 5 minutes, which was unprecedented in the history of the Garrett household, and was understood by everyone to represent the strongest possible form of approval. The winter of 1883 was quiet and cold and full. Eliza recovered her strength quickly, as she did most things, and was back at her desk in the ranch office before Christmas, with Thomas in a basket by the fire and Solomon the cat, who had by now defected entirely to the Garrett ranch and had claimed the kitchen as his sovereign territory, keeping a fond and proprietorial eye on the baby. Lionel managed the winter cattle work with his characteristic careful efficiency, and in the evenings he came in and found his wife at her accounts with their son asleep nearby. And the particular quality of his happiness in these moments was the kind that does not announce itself, but is simply, quietly total. The spring of 1884 brought the beginning of the Sullivan-Garrett cattle operation, as Eliza had planned it, with 40 head of Texas Longhorns acquired through a careful and well-negotiated purchase, and moved onto the Sullivan property's basin pasture. The land received them with the generosity of land that has been well managed, and the grass came in strong along the water channel that Thomas Sullivan had designed 30 years ago, and Eliza rode out every few days to check on them, with the satisfaction of someone whose plans are proceeding as intended. She also, in that spring, began to use Walter Garrett's tools. Not for jewelry, she had no particular talent for that, and she was honest about it, but for repair and maintenance work, for the small metal work that a ranch required in 100 small ways. She found that the tools had been made with such quality that they served well beyond their original purpose, and there was a particular pleasure in using them, in feeling the careful balance of instruments made by a man who had believed in doing things properly. She kept them in the ranch office in their cloth wrapping, and took them out when they were needed, and put them away again with the care they deserved. Lionel found her using them one afternoon in the barn, repairing a latch, and stood for a moment in the doorway watching her before she noticed him. "Your hands are different from his," he said, "but you use them the same way." She looked up. "How do you mean?" "You pay attention to what you're doing. Full attention, not partial." He came and leaned against the barn wall across from her. "My father used to say that the difference between a craftsman and a laborer was entirely a matter of attention. A laborer thinks about what he'll do when the work is done. A craftsman only thinks about the work. That's a good philosophy for accounts as well," she said. "It's a good philosophy for most things," he said, looking at her with the quiet, steady love that she had come to regard as the fixed point of her days, the thing from which the rest could be measured. In the summer of 1884, Eliza received a letter from the Caldwell Territorial Bank informing her that the Sullivan homestead mortgage had been fully satisfied on schedule, and that the bank wished to congratulate the owner on the consistent management of the account. She read the letter at the kitchen table, and Lionel watched her read it and saw the expression that moved across her face, something complex and layered, grief and pride and relief, and the particular satisfaction of having finished something hard. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the top drawer of the ranch office desk, where she kept the things that mattered most, alongside the accounts ledgers and a small daguerreotype of her parents and Walter Garrett's tools. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "My father's land is free." "Your land," he said. She looked at him. "Our land," she corrected, and the word settled between them with the weight of everything they had built, which was considerable and was growing. Autumn came again. Thomas, now a year old, had graduated from the basket by the fire to an ambulatory terror, who pursued Solomon the cat with cheerful persistence, and was developing strong opinions about everything, particularly about the horses, whom he regarded with a reverence that suggested he would be riding before his second birthday, whether or not anyone intended that. Lionel watched his son's fierce engagement with the world with a delight that Eliza found regularly moving, because it was the same unguarded delight she had first seen in August of 1882 when she had made him laugh in the auction house, multiplied and deepened and made permanent. She discovered she was carrying again in November. This time she told him in the ranch office, in the evening, with the lamp lit and the accounts open between them and the snow beginning outside. He set down his coffee cup with exquisite care, as though it required his full attention, and then he looked at her with the same arrested happiness as before, slightly more practiced in its expression and no less genuine. "April," she said before he could ask. "April," he said. He reached for her hand. "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said, "though I have extremely strong opinions about ginger tea at the moment." "There is still ginger tea," he said. "I never did cancel the standing order." She laughed. He laughed. The office was warm and the snow fell outside, and Thomas was asleep upstairs with Solomon monitoring him from the foot of the bed, and the accounts were almost finished, and the land was free, and Walter Garrett's tools were in the desk drawer wrapped in cloth, and the ring on Eliza's right hand caught the lamplight the way it always had, warm and amber and present, the way her mother had wanted it, like sunlight even in the cold months. Their daughter was born in late April of 1885, on a morning when the plains were greening up after the winter, and the Chicaskia River was running bright through the cottonwoods. And she was a small, determined person with her mother's dark hair and her own highly individual set of opinions about the world, which she expressed with clarity from the first moment. They named her Clara Jane Garrett, Clara for Eliza's mother, Jane for Lionel's mother, who had died when he was 17, and whom he spoke of with a quiet, unfinished love that Eliza understood in the way she understood most things about him, which was completely. Dora, upon hearing this name, simply sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Good," in a tone of total finality. The years that followed made themselves, as years do when the foundations are sound, each one different from the last, each one carrying its own particular gifts and difficulties. There were years when the rains came right and years when they did not. There were seasons when the cattle thrived and seasons when disease moved through the territory, and every rancher held their breath and managed carefully. There was the year when the south fence washed out in a spring flood, and it took 3 weeks to repair, and the year when Copper the stallion produced a foal of such exceptional quality that Eliza was able to sell it for a price that surprised even Lionel, who had thought he understood the market for horses. There was the year when Thomas broke his arm falling from a fence he had absolutely been told not to climb, and the year when Clara said her first complete sentence, which was, "I can do it myself," a statement of philosophy she maintained consistently thereafter. Through all of it, the ranch managed, grew, and endured. The Sullivan-Garrett operation became something that people in the territory spoke of with the particular respect they reserved for enterprises that were run by people who knew what they were doing and cared about doing it well. The breeding records Eliza had built in the fall of 1882 became the foundation of a horses program that produced animals of consistent quality, and the herd management system she had designed was refined and improved through successive seasons, until it was so good that 2 neighboring ranchers asked if she would teach it to them, which she did, methodically and without condescension, because she held the same view as her mother, which was that good information shared was a multiplication of good. The ranch office changed over the years, the shelves filling with the evidence of an active and engaged mind, books on animal husbandry and soil management, and the accounts of other agricultural regions, a growing stack of correspondence with the Kansas State Agricultural Society in Topeka, to whom Eliza had begun submitting observations that were received with increasing seriousness. The daguerreotype of her parents watched over this accumulation with the patient approval of the well-remembered dead. On a morning in the summer of 1887, Eliza sat at the ranch office desk and opened the drawer where she kept the things that mattered most. She took out Walter Garrett's tools, which she had used just the previous week to repair a piece of copper piping in the kitchen, and which she always returned to their cloth wrapping with the same care. She took out the letter from the Caldwell Territorial Bank, its paper yellowed slightly now at the folds. She took out the small daguerreotype of her parents and looked at her mother's face, young and clear and full of the anticipation of a life that was just beginning. Her mother was wearing the ring in the photograph. Eliza had never noticed that before, or had noticed it and forgotten, or had simply been unable to look closely enough to be sure. But there it was, the tiny dark point of the amber stone on Clara Hewitt Sullivan's right hand, caught in the silver chemistry of the image. Lionel appeared in the doorway. He was 40 now, and the years had settled on him well, deepening the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw without diminishing anything essential. He looked at her, and at the photograph in her hands, and came to stand beside her. She showed him. He looked at the tiny point of amber on her mother's hand in the photograph, and then at the same ring on her daughter's hand, worn thin and brilliant with 30-something years of love. "She brought it all the way from Winchester," Eliza said softly. "And my father put it on her hand before she left," he said, "without knowing any of this, without knowing it would come here. Things find their way," she said. "I think that's what you said to me in the auction house, or something like it." "I said the world was smaller than we usually let ourselves think," he said. "That's the same thing." He sat down in the chair beside the desk and took her hand in his, the way he had 10,000 times, and she let him, the way she had 10,000 times, and they looked together at her mother's photograph in the summer morning light of the ranch office, with the sounds of the place they had built together coming in through the open window. Thomas in the yard with the dogs, Clara's voice rising in some spirited argument about something, the horses moving in the south pasture. The ordinary and extraordinary music of a life. "I think we should go to Winchester," she said. He looked at her. "When?" "Not this year. The fall is busy. Next spring, maybe, we could take the children. Show them where their grandfathers came from." She paused. "I'd like to see Grayson Street, where your father's shop was." "I'd like that too," he said. And then, with the particular gentleness he reserved for things that mattered most, "Your mother would like knowing you got there." Eliza looked down at the ring on her right hand. She thought about the morning in August of 1882 when she had stood at the registration desk of the Hargrove auction house, running out of time and out of money, and running on courage and a dead woman's ring. She thought about the feeling of being watched, and looking up to find a pair of clear green eyes not on her face but on her hand. She thought about the voice from 2 rows forward in the auction benches, bidding high and clear and firm, and the November porch and the October lamplight, and the December snow on the church steps, and all the ordinary and extraordinary mornings that had come after. She thought about Walter Garrett making a wedding ring for a young woman in Winchester, Ohio, hammering the silver claw around a small amber stone with the careful attention of a craftsman, and telling the story to his 12-year-old son, and the son carrying the story west with him, and keeping it for 20 years until a woman walked into an auction house, and the story finally arrived at its continuation. She thought about her mother, who had wanted a ring that looked like sunlight even in the cold months, and who had gotten exactly that, and who had worn it every day of her life until her last day, and who had left it to her daughter like a compass set to point toward the thing she had found herself, the knowledge that love, properly chosen and properly tended, endures. "She knows," Eliza said. Lionel squeezed her hand once firmly and let it rest. Outside, Thomas was calling for his father about something with the urgent authority of a 4-year-old, who has decided that the matter is pressing. And Clara's argument appeared to have escalated to a new register of volume and confidence. And Solomon, the cat, could be heard expressing his views on all of it from somewhere near the barn. And the horses were moving in the pasture in their own green and golden world. And the Chicaskia River was running through the cottonwoods on its ancient and indifferent course. And the Kansas morning opened itself wide and bright above the land that Eliza Sullivan and Lionel Garrett had paid for in full, in money, in work, in grief, in courage, in the precise and unrelenting practice of loving well. She put the photograph back in the drawer. She put the tools back in their cloth wrapping. She put the bank letter in its place. She closed the drawer. Then she stood up from the ranch office desk and walked out into the morning with her husband beside her, and the ring on her hand caught the light the way it always did, warm and amber and present, like sunlight even in the cold months, exactly as her mother had asked for it to be, all those years ago in a jeweler's shop on Grayson Street in Winchester, Ohio, at the beginning of everything.